describe current crisis trends or characteristics. We will also try, like the previous speakers, to convey some idea about the post-war and more recent processes of socio-economic development in Greece. And that's because we believe that the historical context and the local social and political circumstances are crucial for understanding the current transformations taking place in Athens as well as in other Greek cities. And it is equally crucial for the mutual understanding of crisis in cities of Southern Europe. It's mostly in the urban condition where crisis is most severely experienced and reflected. And that's the main reason why we'll examine the relation between the urban transformation patterns and the mutations of political and economic program implemented. So in the following slides, we will provide some background information regarding Greek society, its economy and production system, focusing particularly on the production of space, and we'll try to discuss the role of the state in this process. One of the major transformations throughout the entire post-war period is a rapid urbanization all over Greece, with Athens, the capital, being the most emblematic example in terms of all development indicators, such as GDP, population, income, etc. Another major transformation relevant to that of urbanization has to do with processes of social integration, which resulted in the creation of a disproportionate, for some, wide middle class, which has been highly interrelated with the prevailing urban patterns and processes. Thus, key factors for the production of urban space were small-scale ownership, small family enterprises, and private housing construction, self-built or informal for the poor, and built through a small-scale, again, commercial construction system for the lower and middle classes. Within a context of mediocre industrialization up to the 80s and rapid urbanization process, as we said, the tertiary sector, with a particular significance attached to the public sector, construction and tourism, became primary field of economic growth. The role of the state has been ambivalent since, on the one hand, it provided a flexible framework to support this kind of economy and was tolerant to informality. On the other, it did not actually provide significant welfare services or efficient regulatory mechanisms. Thus, for example, social housing and planning remained marginal and catered only for particular groups. This kind of small-scale, semi-formal development, widely sustained by family or local social networks, has to some extent substituted the weak welfare state and functioned as a safety net, creating opportunities of social and economic mobility for broader social groups. Apart from negative side effects of this more or less informal and not so much regulated urban development, such as lack of open public or green spaces, etc., one of the most beneficial ones is reflected upon the form of urban space, especially in the downtown areas. Greek cities developed into a relatively coherent urban system due to social mixture and multifunctionality of urban space, more compactly in their central areas, less so in their periphery. More recently, that is around the 80s, negative economic trends such as deindustrialization as well as population aging became gradually all the more obvious. It's more or less since the 80s when we start discussing the inefficiencies of public sector, the wide spectrum of corruption and cliental relations, whereas informality is considered a slump in the road to development. This stage coincides more or less with Greece becoming an official member state of the EU in 1981 and one of the most prominent clients of the Social Cohesion Fund. All along the 80s and 90s, we're witnessing a gradual rise of living standards, as well as a significant diffusion of a consumerist lifestyle. Following the neoliberal project of the 90s, and based upon the financial aid from the EU, the economic restructuring produced an all the more weakened primary and secondary sector in favor of services, a new construction boom, and respected development of the real estate sector. It also intensified speculation on land and enlarged the involvement of banks in construction, either in housing, mainly through loans, or in large-scale development infrastructure projects, mainly focused around road networks, and even more so in the region of Athens, Attica. And this trend was further intensified by major milestones of the time, such as the country's entry in the Eurozone in 2002 and the Olympic Games in 2004. In the context of urban development, inefficiency of planning and gradual degradation of the built environment in big cities have been systematically interrelated with the suburbanization process already there from the beginning of the 80s and further intensified as urban dispersal since late 90s. Another major transformation is the significant influx of migrants since the early 90s, and first and mostly from neighboring Balkan countries and East Europe, and later on from Central and East Asia, as well as from Africa. The integration of cheap and mostly informal labor in the labor market has unquestionably sustained development sectors of the time, mainly construction, but also personal services that still and all the more substituted the weak or inexistent welfare states, such as housekeeping, catering for old, babysitting, etc. Depending on labor market needs, immigrants had to cope, among other things, with a broader or more faint resurgence of racist reflexes and practices stemming from social groups all along the socioeconomic spectrum. Last, from the perspective of ideology and politicization, the post-war polarization between left and right started to fade away during the 80s, especially during the last 20 years. Two main political formations, or parties, PASOK and New Democracy, interchanged seats in power, though with their respective differentiations in socioeconomic rhetoric and practice fading gradually to the degree of extinction. This contributed to the consolidation of particular socioeconomic elites highly related to and dependent upon political personnel. It also contributed to the gradual depoliticization of the discourse. Throughout the entire post-war period, modernization stood as a permeating ideal of varying emphasis. Particularly in the 90s, a new version of modernization rhetoric emerged, giving precedence to rational administration and experts' authority, while in essence neglecting participatory processes. And maybe the only traces that weren't few, though, of radical political perspective during the 90s and 2000s can be spotted mainly in the reasoning and practice of social movements concerning matters of special or local interest, social, ecological, or other, mostly at the local level. Now, arriving to crisis. All those circumstances allowed for both the event of crisis and the major rhetoric about it. In 2010, when Greece turned for help to Troika, the crisis was announced as a depoliticized mismanagement result, as a systematic mistake mostly produced by the people. No official explanations of the crisis were offered in the context of a broader or even global economic system. The crisis had to be perceived as a locally determined inefficiency for which locals are bound to blame and pay. Apart from financial indices and statistics, crisis is more than anything else the wide repercussions of crisis therapy. Again, ideologies mobilized all along the official public discourse so as to conveniently justify both crisis and therapy. Conveniently for the most powerful elites that won't give way to their status and respective privileges so easily. More specifically, in order for therapy to be endured without resistance or even subversion of actual sociopolitical hierarchy, a tremendous effort has been invested upon achieving social consensus, mainly via the political personnel and the mainstream media. All sorts of cuts and dissolution or dismantling experiments are presented as a one-way solution. There is no alternative, a TINA program, for the encounter of financial deficit or the debt. Main attributes of the discourse are the systematic defamation of public sector, the fandom of tax evasion, the propagated collective guilt of we all stole together, which is a famous quote here in Greece, mainly aiming at the middle class's conscience, the implementation of divide and rule through the demonization of the other, namely the public servant, depending on the timing, or the immigrant, or the syndicalized, etc. In that context, and apart from the propaganda and the consolidation of adequate preconceptions, of crucial importance is also the process of sweeping revision of all legal framework in the name of the debt, or in the name of saving the country, or remaining in Eurozone, competitiveness, attractiveness for investment, or just development. With a highly unstable political elite in government, supported by bankers, the legislative breakthroughs through those 2.5 years of crisis are being achieved by seemingly legal, yet profoundly anti-democratic parliamentary procedures, even to the extent of being against important constitutional provisions. In the socio-political agenda of the crisis, last but not least comes the systematic capitalization of fear against poverty and dispossession, mainly of the relatively loosely politicized middle strata, by encouraging both a sense of self-conservation within a family and locality, or even the nation, and the hatred against the other, who is criminalized as stealer of one's development prospects. The totality of that fearful hate allowed for the rise of fascist groups' popularity, which even achieved their ultimate legalization by winning a substantial number of parliament seats in Greek parliament in the last elections of 2012. Moreover, capitalization of fear, combined with the necessity of passing very painful measures dictated by the memoranda, paved the way for prioritizing the repression of lawfulness, anomia in Greek, which provided the necessary legitimization for extensive use of state violence. Yet, and despite propaganda and social repression, and apart from traditional forms of social resistance and organization, such as strike, demonstration, occupation of buildings, etc., new forms of mobilization emerged, prevalent expression of which was the creation of multiple exchange and solidarity networks, and certainly the Indignados and the movement of the squares. The movement of the squares in Greece is tightly connected also to its South-European equivalents, as well as to the dynamics inherited by December 2008 insurgents, which also shared the particularity of intense expression of social rage, coming from an unusual and unconventional social mix that broadly represented middle class's agony towards lack of perspective for the future. Now, following the structure of previous speakers, some notes on the promoted reforms and strategies in the context of crisis. In other words, what stands as a description of therapy, crisis therapy. Under the memoranda signed between the Greek state and the Troika, the Greek state signed obligations of major structural reforms that seem to transmute neoliberal development towards an ultra-neoliberal direction. The therapeutic menu seems to include well-known strategies of selling and degrading, or degrading first and then selling, that have been already put on practice elsewhere, from Chile of the 70s since nowadays, with relatively ambiguous results, to say the least. These reforms could be codified as follows. First, privatization of strategic public sector companies, such as water, electricity, and the like, as well as state-owned real property. New legislation framework that deregulates space production by lifting again all sorts of limitations and preconditions for land development, thus facilitating and accelerating large-scale investment on public or private land at the investor's taste. Vast cuts of personnel, salaries and resources from the public sector, all sorts of public sector, ministries, local government, and public services. Significant and practically unsustainable immediate or indirect tax increases, mostly on property, aiming at middle and lower strata, whilst at the same time tax relief for the few high income. Last, new legislation framework that disintegrates labor rights in the name of the all-prevalent notions of flexibility and competitiveness, thus increasing precariousness of labor, especially in the private sector. Now we're coming to the effects as reflected in space and society. The crisis comes as a multidimensional phenomenon that affects everyone in multiple ways, increasing existing inequalities and creating new ones based primarily on people's access to work, housing and social services. To illustrate, we now offer a spectrum of crisis, main effects upon Greek society, And we have organized these effects under some broad group titles. The first one is the evaluation of labor and living standards. So under this title, we have this rapid increase of the percentage of people falling below the poverty line, with estimates for relative poverty for this year, 2013, around 24.8%, and a rapid decrease of middle class's disposable income, around half compared to 2008 for employed and pensioners, mainly due to taxes, this kind of decrease. Substantial devaluation of living standards for the many, with access to food, housing, public services, etc., and increase of private debt due to new taxes, housing loans, and subsequent price increase. We also have substantial degradation of public services like health, education, transport, etc., and rapid rise of unemployment, again, especially for the young, with official estimates for this year around 29%, whilst the real unemployment is expected to reach 34%. Also, significant emigration flows, especially of highly qualified young people, plus the internal reverse pattern of migration from big cities to smaller cities and villages. We also have some estimates for Greece exporting migrants, and it's supposed to be at the fastest rate in Europe, even faster than Spain. Degradation of all environmental standards and indicators, disintegration of family networks that stood as a substitute of the welfare state that we have already mentioned, and a rapid rise of precariousness and unaffordability for small and medium-scale property, and last, the new inequalities arising between generations. The second group of effects is in the context of humanitarian crisis indicators. Humanitarian crisis, codified as poverty, malnutrition, diseases, homelessness, or inadequate housing, with some statistics here, over than 20,000 homeless right now in Athens, and 250,000 people resorting only to churches' sub-kitchens, because it's quite difficult to count how many people have access to food in that way, and this is for 2011. Increased vulnerability and precariousness for the most vulnerable groups, emergence of new poor social groups, which include former middle-class people, and therefore increase of marginalization, rise of insecurity and despair, and extreme evidence of which is the dramatic increase of suicides and suicidal attempts, around 4,000 is one of the last valid estimates, and rise of public resentment and social depression, and further consolidation of a social feeling of unjust. Now, this is one of the famous yesterday's photos outside the Ministry of Agriculture. Now, the third group of effects is under the title Polarization and Violence. We have increased polarization between the haves and the have-nots, or the ones perceived as such. We have polarization between opposed political orientation groups based upon the questionable way out of crisis, mainly under the directions pro or anti-memorandum solution, and the respective diffusion and adoption of reactionary ideas and practices. Even worse than that, we have open and outright fascist and racist social and political expression, and relevant rise of racist criminal attacks against particular ethnic groups, which in general stay unrecorded and unpunished, plus the relative radicalization of particular social groups, irrespective of their actual economic situation. Last, we have all the more often violation of human rights, particularly of the most vulnerable groups, and unprecedented recourse to violence by the state police, used against demonstrators or immigrants, especially the colored ones, and anti-fascists, of course. And we have already numerous official and media reports condemning Greece in relation to police brutality, violation of human rights, etc. Now we're focusing on a little bit more on Athens before closing the description. Athens has been, up to quite recently, the emblem of development throughout the entire post-war period, the major agglomeration node for the accumulation and reproduction of labor, capital, knowledge and investment. Athens is the seat of power in a highly centralized state, and following global trends of urban development since the late 90s, it also became a field for large-scale urban projects and had been celebrated in 2004 as a flashy city host of a global event such as the Olympic Games. It doesn't then come as a surprise that it is mostly here in Athens where the effects of crisis became obvious in the most blatant and violent way, with the first signs spotting particularly the city center. The crisis is reflected on closed shops, of course, vacant dwellings or vacant buildings, flats, dilapidated built environment and public space, even more so in the downtown areas. And we have this, those areas that were celebrated as nodes of multiculturalism in the mid-2000s, or even a little bit before, during the Games hype, that soon begin to stand as examples of ghetto in the dominant public discourse, even before the official start of the crisis. We have a rather immediate official response to this ghettology based upon the adoption of this rhetoric, thus formalizing spatial segregation in ethnic or economic terms, reproducing fear and calling for security, namely against criminal others, which in most cases is the immigrants. At the same time, organized crime, prostitution, drug trafficking and use become all the more visible in the public space and hold a central part in the mainstream agenda, mainly associated with immigrants. And as to the scenery, among the main characteristics are dilapidated built environment, as we said, neglected public space, deteriorating environmental conditions, especially in the center, inactive up to now real estate market, with the thousands of still vacant dwellings, offices or commercial spaces, reduction of land prices, and a huge stock of unsold, even new built houses, primarily in the periphery of Athens. Together with the real estate and urban renewal visions that emphasize most on improving physical environment, what mostly came as an actual practice and physical decoration, if we can say it, was extensive and aggressive forms of policing, rather against people that do or seem to think differently than against criminal circuits, despite the dominant rhetoric of zero tolerance. When the real crisis entered the official discussion and the scenery, Athens became the theater for the most numerous evictions, foreclosures, auctions, closed shops, numerous homeless, drug addicts, all over the place, in the center, etc. In short, it turned into the most painful reflection of the humanitarian crisis. For the ones that still endure sustaining a normal life, the overall deterioration of public services, like street cleaning, transport, child care, etc., makes things even worse. Last, the wartime analogy of crisis dimensions is also reflected upon the broad revival of wartime practices, such as the sharp increase of pawn shops, especially in areas of lower income people, the firewood business to deal with the petrol tax, and on the other hand, people eating in sub-kitchens or making a living for informal recycling, etc. So, as a conclusion, main transformations taking place in terms of socioeconomic and spatial arrangement is the dispossession of both public and private, mainly small-scale property, and the facilitation of its reallocation, namely in larger sums and among fewer owners, which is the idea of redistribution, revisited though, or largely what maybe Harvey would call accumulation by dispossession. The object of dispossession in this time of crisis is, on the one hand, and primarily, common goods and public property, like common facilities and social services, infrastructure, natural resources, land, etc. On the other, directly private property as well as rights, human, labor, or citizenship rights. The most dispossessed are being pushed to the edge of the system. They get excluded and marginalized. the entire society becomes rather exclusive, expelling the ones that cannot meet their own needs on their own economic or other resources. Whilst dependency for survival is on sharp increase, the state is retreating. Within the context of crisis and dispossession, space acquires a central role, either as one of the most important development factors for the reactivation of real estate and the economy, or as a source of revenue for paying up the debt, and privatization, dispossession, and sociopolitical control need the state to sell or to guarantee that process and the success of the restructuring. Hence, apart from selling of property, state has to withdraw and redefine its own purpose by giving way to the markets and all private investments. The process of this withdrawal can be seen as deregulation. Now, within the context of cities in the crisis, urban space can be seen as loot or as assets, as places or objects for making profit, but it can also be seen as shelter or as a field of social inclusion, solidarity and interaction, or as a scene for collective expression and formation of new collective claims. The right to the city is put under question, therefore becomes a very important claim. Spatial implications or expressions of crisis in our cities make it more obvious than ever that in fact there is no alternative than to defend space. Only photo examples of defending space. Thank you very much.